This is Kathy from Gadget Stop 321, and in today's video I'm going to be comparing the nibs of the pilot pens in my collection. Now these pens have both stainless steel nibs and what I would consider entry-level 14 karat gold nibs. I've got extra fine through Broad Nibs that I'll be doing writing samples with. I'll be doing my writing samples on a Rhodia ice pad. This has 80 GSM paper. And I'm going to begin with a Pilot 78G. It has an extra fine stainless steel nib. For these writing samples, each of the pens have been dipped in Diamine Oxford Blue. This Oxford Blue is really well suited for this extra fine nib. For an extra fine, it's very smooth and it puts down a nice consistent line in every direction. It has what I would describe as just a nice pencil type feedback. Next, I have a Pilot Prera. It has a fine stainless steel nib, and it has the same type of feed as the 78G. The fine nib is noticeably smoother than the extra fine, and again I'm getting a nice uniform line in every direction. The feedback to me as a user of fine nibs, and I enjoy using fine nibs, I would describe this as smooth. Now that just means smooth when compared to other fine nibs. Next I'll be writing with my Pilot Legno with a black finish. It has a number 3 size 14 karat fine nib, and the feed is a different style than that you saw on the 78G and the Prera. The filler hole is down close to the tip of the nib. Now the first thing I notice when writing with this nib after writing with the two steel nibs is that it feels bouncy, noticeably bouncy. And another thing I notice with this nib is that the upstroke is noticeably drier than every other direction. I kind of like that about this nib because it gives my writing just a slight amount of line variation that looks very good with some inks. Next, I have another Pilot Legno in the red finish. It also has a number 3 size 14 karat fine nib. Now, I didn't notice it until I wrote with these two pens side by side, but this nib is slightly more stiff than the nib on the black pen, but it is still a little bit bouncy, just not as bouncy as the black nib. Now, one thing I do need to mention, the black nib, I did have to do some work on it when I first received it. It's strange, it was scratchy in every direction. That's the first time I had come across that in a nib, so it wasn't an issue with nib alignment. There was just some, I guess, some scratchiness within the nib slit, so I did have to do some work on it. That could be the reason the black nib is more bouncy. This one came straight to me, perfectly tuned, and it's a little bit wetter in the up direction than this nib, though this nib, the dryness in the up direction, I have seen that in other gold nibs on my Pilot pens. Now that little hard start there is just from me talking for quite a while with the pen uncapped. Next, I have a light blue Pilot Grants. It has a 14 karat fine nib. Now, it's not marked on the nib, but in my research, this seems to also be a number 3 size nib, similar to the ones on my two Pilot leg nose, but I haven't tried to interchange them. This nib has drier upstrokes similar to the black Legno, and this one has noticeably more feedback than the first two, and it's a bit stiffer, kind of like the red Legno, but has the drier upstrokes like the black Legno, but has more feedback than either of these two, but it's not unpleasant. In fact, it feels similar to the pencil-y type feedback that I got with the 78G. Next, I've got a Pilot Pluminix. It has a fine stainless steel nib, but you can see it doesn't have any tipping, and it's kind of stubby at the end, or kind of an italic type grind. The stub nibs that you can get on the Pilot Metropolitan are marked cursive medium. This one is a cursive type nib, but it's just marked fine. One thing I wanted to point out on this nib that I just noticed when I was doing these writing samples is, look at the gap between the feed and the nib. That's something I'm going to have to work on. And the reason I noticed that is because with these dip tests, in between writing samples, this one was drying out on me. So I'm going to have to re-dip this one before I do the writing sample. And dipping it into this small diamine bottle is kind of a chore with this Pluminix because the section doesn't fit. So I'm going to have to do this off camera. This nib is very smooth, especially with like dark saturated inks, but it also is very crisp on the edges, so you have to pay attention to the rotation and the angle of the nib when you're writing. The only pens I've ever found this fine stub nib on, or this fine calligraphy nib, is the Pluminix. Next, I've got a Pilot Lucina. This one actually has a cartridge in it with ink. It has a gold-plated steel fine nib. The feed looks similar to the feed that was found on the Legno, but it doesn't have the filler hole down close to the tip. This nib, similar to the Prera, puts down a uniform line in all directions. It's nice and smooth, just a hint of feedback. Let me see. As you would expect, it has a very similar writing experience, writing feel to the Prera. They're both fine steel nibs. This is the type of nib I enjoy using with these type of dark saturated inks like black or blue-black. Next, I've got a Pilot Custom 74. It has a number 5 size, 14 karat fine nib, and the feed has the filler hole close to the tip like we saw on the Pilot Legno. This nib has a very similar feel to my black Pilot Legno. It's got the drier upstrokes like we saw on the Legno, and it's also very smooth and has that bouncy feel to it. And the last fine nib in my Pilot collection is the E95S. It has a 14 karat fine nib. I've heard this nib described as both inlaid and also I've heard it called an intarsia nib. This nib is noticeably more broad than the other fine nibs in my collection, and the E95S does have a reputation for writing a little more broad than the nib size that's indicated. It has just a slight amount of feedback, still very smooth, very pleasant to write with, and writes very uniform in all directions. Next, I'll be writing with the medium nibs in my Pilot collection, and I'm going to begin with my Pilot Stargazer. It has a number 3 size, 14 karat medium nib, and it's the same style and size of nib that we saw on the Pilot Legno. This medium nib is a little more uniform in each direction than the Legno nib and the Grant's fine nibs, but I still do find with some drier inks you do notice a little more dryness in the upstrokes, but this is a very smooth nib. And I do feel a little bounciness in this nib, but I don't attempt to flex any of my nibs, so any of these that I say are bouncy, I still write with a fairly light hand. Next, I have another Pilot Grants. This one has a marble, I think that it was described as a marble gray finish. It has a different style clip than the first Grants that I showed. It has a 14 karat medium nib, again with the filler hole close to the tip. Again, with this darker, more saturated ink, it's hard to see that the upstroke was a little bit drier than the others. I could feel it when I was writing, but it's not as noticeable as it was with the Custom 74 and the light blue Pilot Grants and with the black Legno. When writing with this Grants on its own, I usually consider it pretty smooth, but since I'm writing it with it side by side with these other nibs, I do notice more of a pencil type feedback with this one, just like with the other Pilot Grants. But it's not quite as noticeable as it was with the fine nib, and that is to be expected. Next, I've got another Pilot 78G. This one is one of the older originals. You can see that the engraving on the nib is actually, I guess, stamped into the nib maybe. It's not laser engraved. This is a gold-plated medium nib with the same feed that is found on the Prera and the Metropolitan. I have a few duplicates of this medium nib. I have a few 78Gs that have this medium nib on them, and they vary in wetness. This is one of the more, I would call this average wetness for these 78Gs. I have had some that were fairly dry, and I liked it. It worked well with wet inks. But I would call this one an average wetness, and it writes very uniform in each direction like the nib on the Prera did. But I really like these Pilot Steel medium nibs. If you don't like feedback and you're wanting to get as fine of a line as possible, this is just a nice satiny smooth. I almost wouldn't call it feedback, just enough friction that it's not like glassy smooth and you're slipping and sliding it all over the place. It is a satiny, like satin, smooth. Next, I've got a Pilot Metropolitan. It has a stainless steel calligraphy medium nib. It has the same type of feed as those found on the 78G and the Pereira. The nibs on the Metropolitan have that little design laser engraved into it, but it's interchangeable with the 78G and the Pereira, and also the Pluminix and the Pluminix and the Cocuno. They all use the same style of nib. It's not as visible with this dark saturated ink, but the upstrokes are a little bit drier. I find that the writing experience I get with this nib varies from ink to ink. With nice, wet, saturated inks like this Oxford Blue, this nib works wonderfully. And again, it has that, I would describe this almost as a velvety smoothness. Just feels very luxurious, but some drier inks really feel dry on the page. Some of those more pale inks, pale watery inks. This nib is a little bit too wide for my taste. I write fairly small. I prefer the fine stub nib that came on my Pluminix. And this nib is described by a lot of places as a 1.0 stub nib, and I think that's pretty accurate. Next, I've got a Pilot Custom Heritage 91. It has a number 5 size 14 karat medium nib. It's the same style of nib that was found on the Custom 74. You're seeing this is another example of drier upstrokes like you saw here on the Custom 74. And where on the Custom 74 I described it as bouncy, I don't notice the bounciness as much on this Custom Heritage 91. With the broader nib, I'm noticing more of the smoothness. Next, I've got one more 78G. It also has the older nib. You can see from the stamping of the information on the nib. It's a stainless steel broad nib, but it's actually more of a stub or even more of a crisp italic. There's no tipping, and it's got that same feed as the Pereira and Metropolitan. This nib writes similar to the cursive medium nib that came on my Pilot Metropolitan, but it's a little more crisp and it's a little drier. In fact, it had a pretty significant hard start here at the beginning. I've had a lot of trouble with this nib. When I first got it, it was pretty scratchy and would not put ink on the page. I'm not sure exactly what the problem was. I did some smoothing on it to get rid of some of the scratchiness, and I kind of did some flexing of the nib to kind of open up the tines a little bit to try to let a little more ink through. I've heard a lot of good things about this 78G broad nib. It's just a bit too crisp for my taste. but it has been fun just to play with ink with this nib. Out of, I think I've got 6 of these 78Gs. This is the only one that I had to do some nib work on. I would classify this one as smooth and crisp. And mine, though, is a bit dry. And finally, I've got another Pilot Lucina. This one has a steel broad nib. And as far as I can tell, the broad nibs only come in the black finish. This broad nib is, I would consider it nice and wet. It does feel maybe a bit drier on the up and left strokes, but I think that gives it like a nice chalky smoothness. Very nice. And another good thing about this broad nib is that this one's a nice reverse writer. Just a wonderful reverse writer. This goes from a Japanese broad to a very fine nib, very usable. You see it's not running dry. It writes nice and consistently in all directions. Pretty smooth for a fine nib. Let me see. I would call it just a nice feedback. If you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.